Hello, I'm Jenya Delima. Welcome to Writing and Editing, the author-focused podcast that takes a whole-person approach to everything related to both writing and editing. We might have an idea for a piece of writing, but then be held back by a number of fears, and these can include the fear of not being good enough, of not knowing how to reach our audience, or of being judged or maybe having our work criticized. So how do we find the courage to push these fears aside and start writing? Here to answer that question is author Ginny Kubitz Moyer. Thank you for being here today, Ginny.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Did you have to face any of your own fears before you started writing?
I did, and it's funny. I don't know if I would use fear so much as well. Maybe it's the same thing. Fear is uncertainty or insecurity.
Yeah.
I started writing fiction in 2016, and that was a surprise. I started writing in my 40s, and I never had thought that I could actually write fiction. I had always thought that I couldn't come up with a novel because I didn't know how to plot. I didn't know how to come up with a story in advance. So when I started writing my first novel, which was called The Seeing Garden, I was kind of doing it just as a lark, I guess, just sort
Mhm.
of for fun and just see what can happen. What's the worst that can happen? And it turns out you don't need to know a plot in advance. You can figure it out as you go.
Yeah.
There is such a thing as editing at the end. You can go back and look at this whole thing and go, okay, well, I'll change this and this and this and all of that. But I think maybe the fear for me comes more in putting the work out there, I
Mhm.
guess. And that's a piece that I think was a little something that you as an author maybe have to just recognize that you're once you've published something and you're putting it out in the world and people read it, people may not love it. They may actively dislike it, and that's okay. Not every book is for everybody. But in terms of the actual writing itself, I think it was more a question of maybe I had a misperception about what fiction writing was and how it happened. And I think I just needed to face that down.
Mhm. And did you immediately recognize or realize that these were uncertainties? Or was it something where you maybe sat at the blank page for a while and wondered, why am I unable to start writing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually always loved reading, probably as most of your listeners have too, avid readers. And I had always written, I have in my garage somewhere a box of, volumes of a journal that I started keeping in middle school and kept kind of into my 20s. And in my 20s, I started writing articles and I had a blog. And then I had written in my 30s some works of spiritual nonfiction. But I'd always loved fiction. I'd always loved novels. I'd loved losing myself in a good story, right? Like there's nothing better than sitting down with a book and just, being completely sucked into this other world. But I had always thought I can't write a novel because I don't know how to plot.
Mm.
I would try to think of, oh, what could I write a novel about? And nothing that I thought of came to life. And I never got very far because I just couldn't out of the air come up with people who didn't exist and things to happen to them. So it was actually, again, for years, I didn't even really try because I thought, no, I can't write a whole novel. I can't plot in advance. And then in 2016, something just sort of changed and it just felt urgent, I guess, to try.
Mhm.
Um, and I was looking for an idea for my next sort of nonfiction book, and nothing was coming to mind. So I thought, well, what the heck? I'll try writing a novel. And I was approaching it just as a, hey, this will be fun and see what happens. I jokingly call that first book my midlife crisis book because I was in my 40s. I was like, I want to try something different. I'll try writing fiction. I kind of had an idea in mind for that first book. I was inspired by this estate near me. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and there's a very beautiful estate and garden called the Filoli Estate that was built early 1900s. And it's kind of like Downton Abbey in Northern California. And I always loved visiting there. And I was so inspired by the setting. I thought, I'm just going to try writing a book about people living in a place like this. And I just started writing scenes and seeing what came, and more scenes started to come and characters started to take shape. So it was kind of I guess it was a fear that I had or an uncertainty I had before I'd ever really sat down to try it.
Yeah.
I just needed to know that there was another way to approach writing a novel.
Oh, was that something you figured out before you started writing, or was that something you figured out after?
I remember in that summer of 2016, when I was first starting to work on The Scene Garden, I remember thinking, okay, well, I should get books about plot. I mean, I literally bought books about how to write
Oh,
plot
right.
and how to do character development, and I read them and they were useful to some extent. I still couldn't kind of sit there and figure it all out in advance. So I thought, well, I'm just going to start writing. And I started writing little scenes. they ended up being wildly out of order and everything. But in the process
Yeah.
of doing that, I figured out who the characters were and what the conflicts were. And the more I wrote, the more it kind of took shape. And it was really exciting to see that happen. In the writing community, a lot of your listeners are probably familiar with the plotter versus pantser dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
The people who plot everything in advance, or do you fly by the seat of your pants? Although I prefer the term discovery writer. I think that's
Yes.
a more
It's a little
elegant
more polite.
description. It is. So I think I just needed to figure out that there is such a thing as discovery writing and that was, I guess, my way of doing it.
Yeah, do you ever think that maybe some of those writing, and I'm using quote marks here, not that people can see, rules are what sometimes hold people back?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, as with anything that you do that you care about, you can kind of fall into a guilt trap, I guess, around it. And I don't think this was so much what I felt at the beginning. I think as I've gone a little further into my fiction writing career, even I've written 3 novels, I've got a fourth that I'm working on. And every now and then I still sort of have this, oh, maybe I should be doing it this way or that way. But I think that in the final analysis, if you get the writing done, it doesn't really matter what the process was like.
Mm-hmm.
That there are people who will say, "Oh, you have to write every single day," and I don't. I take days off, or I don't write every day, and I can feel when I'm losing the momentum and when I need to start doing more. But I think whatever practice works for you, that's the one to do.
Do you think that those rules might be more hindering, if we're looking at it from this standpoint, for beginning writers more than they are for established writers?
I think probably so, because I think when you're beginning, I mean, at least I can only speak from my own experience, of course, but I do think that I did really have fixed in my mind, oh, I can't write fiction because I can't come up with a whole plot, beginning, middle, and end before I start. And it turns out I didn't need to know that. I could figure that out as I went. So I do think that, at least for me, those were messages probably that were more powerful and that maybe got me, sidelined me a little bit more earlier on than they do now.
Yeah, I can see that too. Well, and then you talked about this a little bit, but seeing those fears dissipate once you began writing, did that happen with all of those uncertainties or just some of them?
I remember with the first book, when I wrote it and finished it, and I mean, I wrote this book, and the first draft of it was like 104,000 words. It was too long, but nobody had seen it. I'd been working on it for 18 months, and my family knew I was writing and everything, but nobody had seen any part of it at all, not a single word except me. And then I had this book. And by that point, I thought, okay, I wonder if this is something other people might enjoy reading.
Mhm.
So I gave it to a friend of mine who's a wonderful writer and a creative writing teacher. I remember with great trepidation sort of giving it to her, because if she said it was absolutely terrible, that would be hard. Again, maybe that's sort of where that fear, the courage kind of comes in a little bit.
Yeah.
But I also think a lesson there too is to choose your first readers wisely, because she's an excellent writer and has a very good critical eye, but she's also very kind. So I knew that if it was terrible, she would tell me kindly. So I would say, find somebody who's a very good editor, but also kind. And that was helpful. And then early on, when I was working with an agent on that first book, I remember she read it and she said, it's going to need some edits. And I remember being petrified of the editing process. And I realized looking back, it was because I kind of didn't know how I had written it the first time, in some sense, that I was still sort of amazed that I'd managed to produce this
Yeah, I can see feeling
novel.
that way. Yeah.
And then I didn't know how I'd done it the first time, so I kind of didn't know how I was going to go in and change it, if that makes sense.
Yes, yes. Yeah, it's almost sort of like going back to the question about craft, where you think, oh, I need a formula for how to do this because I don't know what steps I followed. And if I only had some sort of spreadsheet or rule book or whatever to refer to, I could just copy those steps and it would all be fine.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I was sort of wishing that that existed, right? Because I
Yeah.
feel like there would have been a comfort in, I followed this process and therefore it's all very easy and I've got guidelines. Instead, it kind of felt like this wild, unpredictable inspiration comes and I write and I stitch it all together. And how did this even happen in the first place? And oh no, now I need to change it. It's going to fall apart like a souffle. So I think I just needed to realize that revision is not scary.
Hmm.
I mean, it still is. I'd be honest, a couple novels in, it still sort of is, but what's the worst that can happen, right? You revise it and it's worse than it was the first time. Well, you have a file of the first draft, so you go back to that and I think I needed to learn all of that along the way.
Since you just said revision is still scary, are there any other fears or similar that you think never really go away?
I think, and I know people's writing processes are very different. So I do know there are some authors who talk a lot about their books as they're writing them, and they
Mhm.
run them by people as they're writing them, or people read the first couple chapters and give them feedback. And maybe it's because I'm a discovery writer, but I feel like I can't let anybody into the writing process until I have the whole first draft finished. So I never show any part of a book to anybody until the whole thing is done. And I think that works for me, but that is also scary because once you've finished it and put a year and a half and
Oh,
so much
yeah.
love and heart and soul and everything into this story, and then if you give it to somebody and they say, "Oh, it's terrible. It's, fundamentally flawed," or "There's this terrible weakness at the heart of this," and it all collapses at the beginning and I just couldn't see it. I think there's always that fear. And luckily, I mean, gosh, can I knock on wood? Luckily, it hasn't happened that I've given a book to a beta reader and they've said, "Oh, this is just unsalvageable." That has not happened. So, and if it did happen, honestly, so what? You go back and you fix it. But again, I think as writers, it can be very easy to get ourselves in that fear, and we just need to kind of remind ourselves, what's the worst that can happen, right? The worst that can happen is we go back and refix it.
Do you ever remind yourself of some of these things when you are writing, or maybe those fears do pop up again?
Like when I'm writing a new book,
Hmm.
I think the fears, they're always there. I do think they've gotten a little bit less with each book just because I feel that I feel that I'm more kind of comfortable in the process or trusting the process. But again, I do think when you're a discovery writer, maybe there is, and I can only say this because I am a discovery writer. I don't know. Maybe plotters have fear too, but for discovery writers, the big fear is, oh, what if it doesn't all end up hanging together? What
Right.
if at some
Yeah.
point all these wildly disparate things don't cohere and it's too much to try to edit?
Hmm.
So I think that's kind of always the challenge. But on the flip side, it's really exciting to just feel that the characters are there and you're just uncovering them, which is sort of what discovery writing has always felt like to me.
So you mentioned comfort and then trusting the process. But do you think that confidence is also a part of what maybe diminishes some of these fears?
I think so. I think for sure. And I think there's nothing like getting feedback from people when they say, "I loved your book. I was so invested in it." I got an email just the other day from a woman who reached out through my website, and she had just read The World at Home, which is my most recent book, and she said, "I finished it in 2 days." And when people say like, I was so invested I couldn't put it down,
Mhm.
that's honestly that's just the best feeling because those are the kind of books that I love to read, and to realize that I'm putting that out in the world for other people to enjoy, just I mean, it's just amazing. It makes my day.
And do you think that each of these has come from external responses and validation, or is some of it internal as well, or internal growth?
It's a funny thing writing because we can write for ourselves, and I've done that a bunch throughout my life, with all those journals, right? Nobody was seeing them, and probably nobody ever will see them. Or even now, when I'm just free writing and playing around, I'm writing things that I have no intention of ever showing anybody. And that's important and that's valuable, even if it's only seen by me. So I do think there's that piece of it. I think when you're writing for an audience, it's tough because people say, don't write for an audience. You need to write the book that only you can tell, which is certainly true. On the other hand, if nobody wants to read it and nobody responds to it and nobody gives you any positive feedback, that could be kind of soul crushing. So I think there is a blend. But I think the good news is that the more you write and the more you kind of care about your craft and improving and reading other good writers and learning from them, I think you just naturally keep getting better.
Mhm. And what are some of the ways then that you learned from other writers?
Oh my goodness. Every now and then people talk about, oh, I'm a writer, but I don't like to read. And I feel like that's always really hard for me to wrap my head around because I came to writing because I love reading so much and I love stories and I've been so shaped by them that I feel honored to be kind of part of that whole magical endeavor.
Yeah.
And I taught high school English for 26 years and it was a great career. And one of the best things about it And I kind of didn't realize this in the middle of it, but looking back now, especially now that I'm writing, what you do when you're a high school teacher is you're reading the same books over and over again. I
Hmm.
mean, the number of times I've read Romeo and Juliet, the number of times I've read Lord of the Flies, I know that book so well, believe me.
Hmm.
But what was wonderful about that is you just absorb the technique of
Hmm.
really wonderful writers. You get a feel for how they pace a story, how they structure a story, their symbolism, the character arcs, the poetry of Shakespeare's language. I mean, all of that just it sinks into you when you keep going back to it. So I really do feel that that's had a profound influence, I think, on my storytelling because I've had the opportunity, and it really has been a privilege to go back to these books, but also, not only am I reading them again, but I was always reading them and then other people were reading them for the first time.
All
And
right.
so I was always getting to see how the stories were affecting other people and what were the parts that moved other people or what were the parts that infuriated other people or what were the parts that had questions. And so I really do think that reading and rereading, it gives you writer tools that you don't even know you have,
Hmm.
but that come out when you need them.
Well, and talking about fiction versus nonfiction, and not just for yourself, but maybe for your students and the essays that you wrote, what sorts of concerns did you see with that kind of writing versus a novel?
I think one thing that can be easy to forget as an adult is how terrifying it is to learn how to write.
Hmm.
And, so many students when it was time for essays. And I mean, to be honest, the kind of essays you normally write in English class are usually not the kind people are really excited about.
Right.
It's not creative writing, or, maybe you're doing an autobiographical piece, that's fun. But, if you're analyzing symbolism in Lord of the Flies, most people aren't really excited about doing that. But yeah, that fear of the blank page. I think as a teacher, you really see that. And I think I had sort of forgotten as a teacher in the first several years what it was like to have that fear because I'd gone to college and majored in English and I'd gone to grad school and I'd kind of learned how to stare down that fear of the blank page, but it is very much there. And I think whenever you start writing seriously it can also be there. So for adults who are sitting there beginning a project, again, that blinking cursor can be really difficult. So I mean, I used to just tell students, hey, just write, you can always go back and fix it.
Right.
Or don't start writing with the introduction paragraph. If you kind of know what your thesis is and you know what your main body parts are, you can just start somewhere else and then go back and fix it later. But yeah, I think the fact of any writing, whether you're doing it for a high school class or you're doing it for publication, is that you can always revise.
Hmm.
You don't have to get it right the first time, and in fact very few people do.
Yeah, that's like I heard at a panel once, someone said you have to give yourself permission to suck. And it's just, but yes, that really is probably some of the best advice out there, as simplistic as it sounds.
It is so true. It is so true. And somebody, and I wish I could give this person credit, but talked about how you can always reshape the clay, but
Mm.
you need to have the clay, right?
Yeah.
And the writing the first draft, that's the clay, right? And it's
Mhm.
not hardened. You can go back and you can rework it, but until you get the words down, you don't have the clay to play around with.
Mhm. Well, and for other writers out there, what are some of the clues that they can look for to see if fear is what is holding them back and not some other reason?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know if this is exactly an answer to the question, but I mean, I used to have students often write in longhand in journals.
Hmm.
And I think there's something about this is kind of a sideways way of answering your question, I think, but I think there can be something about the perfection of type on a screen that makes us feel that we have to get it right the first time. And even, as much as I've been doing this now, there are times with certain projects or certain scenes where I'll just write it longhand first because when it doesn't have to look perfect, then I feel that it doesn't have to be perfect. If that blank page on the Word document or whatever is feeling too daunting, I think writing by hand can be a way to get past that if in fact it is fear that's holding you back.
It's a good strategy. I've heard some similar advice before from various sources, but even just that you're almost more connected to the actual act of writing when you're holding a pen on paper versus at a keyboard. You have less distractions around you as well. You can't open another browser in your notebook.
I think that's so true. And sometimes when I'm working, I will honestly like just turn off the Wi-Fi on my laptop because it can be really easy sometimes,
Hmm.
especially when you're writing and you kind of get stuck or you hit a place where you're not sure, you're doubting yourself or whatever, to just be, oh, I'm going to go look at something else, right?
Right.
I'll go check my email or, I'll go look at whatever. And something about just hanging in there and keeping going even though it's hard is a muscle that I think you develop. And again, that you can always revise it, right?
Hmm.
It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be there.
Well, and what are some other small adjustments that you believe writers can make to increase their confidence or even feel more comfortable in the whole process?
It's going to be different for everybody, but I do think sometimes that telling people that you're a writer can help build that confidence.
Mm,
And I was a teacher for 26 years, and then I was teaching and writing for part of that. And I always led with teaching. If I would meet somebody and they would say, oh, what do you do? I would say, I'm a teacher. And I often wouldn't bring out the writing part. Even when I had published books and published articles, I still, for some reason, it felt too, I don't know if it was imposter syndrome or I don't know. Now that I'm not teaching anymore, I have to lead with writer. And that's actually great because I think it does help you own it a little bit. So if you're comfortable with it, and sometimes it can take a while to get there, but I think just yeah, owning your writer identity is really helpful. Naming yourself. I'm a writer, right?
yeah.
I write, I put words on a page. I care about that. I care about storytelling. I care about language. I care about poetry, whatever your genre is. And I think just reminding yourself that there's an element of it that is not linear.
Hmm.
And I've learned, especially now that I'm writing as my sole focus professionally, that measuring productivity as a writer, if you measure it in terms of, at least again, this is true for me. It might be different for other people, but for me, if I measure in terms of word amount or number of pages I wrote, that's not always the best gauge of what I've been doing because I think a lot of writing is staring off into space.
Yes.
A lot of writing is just being quiet and doing other things. Like I have a little backyard and a garden and I love to garden. And I swear, weeding, pulling weeds, I get some of my best ideas that way because, I'm doing something that doesn't really take any mental effort,
Hmm.
but it kind of creates the space for ideas to come. And so I think we can get agitated about productivity, right? Oh,
Yeah.
I need to write a certain number of pages per day or whatever. But you need the space too, and giving yourself that space to let the ideas come, not measuring productivity for writing in the way that we do a lot of other things in life.
Yeah, very well said. Well, and thank you again for being here. So, if you have any last messages you'd like to leave listeners with?
Oh my goodness. I think the great thing about writing is that you realize how much you go through life absorbing things and they come out in your writing when you need them.
Hmm.
Maybe I see this because I came to fiction writing sort of, in midlife, but it's funny because I can look back now and I can just see how different things from different points of my life have come out in my fiction. And I'm not saying my fiction is autobiographical even, but like the being an English teacher and the reviewing all those books so many times and how that's helped me as a writer or certain little stories I've heard or little anecdotes I've heard or places I've been and you draw on that later on. And
Yeah.
there's no way to predict how that's going to happen, but it is kind of a reminder that maybe in some ways the best preparation for writing is just to fully live, right?
Ooh, that is so good.
Yeah, just get out in the world and be present.
Hmm.
And it's tough because we do live in a world with so much content coming at us all the time.
Yeah, that's true too. Just knowing
And
what to filter in and filter out, also, maybe.
yeah, absolutely. Like going for a walk and not having anything in your ears, right? Just going for a walk and not listening to something else, but listening to what, is happening in the world around you and just being fully present and just taking all of that in. And
Yeah.
Julia Cameron in her book, The Artist's Way, talks about artist dates, right?
Oh, right.
Take your inner artist on a date to a museum or a garden or, just do something. And I really think it is about living and filling that well and yeah, just being present in the world and all of that, absorbing it all. And it's going to come out when you need it.
Mm-hmm. Well,
When you're
marvelous.
writing a chapter and you're stuck. So yeah.
Yes. No, those are such wonderful insights. And well, thank you again.
Oh, absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
It was a joy.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening, and be sure to check out the show notes for additional information. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Thanks again.